Good afternoon. My name is Brad Stone, and I am a senior executive editor at Bloomberg News. I am just so pleased today to be back at the Commonwealth Club and to serve as moderator for this virtual conversation with my friend and colleague, Bloomberg editor Max Chafkin. We're here to discuss Max's fascinating new book, The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. The book has made many headlines since it's been released, and I'm really excited to speak today with Max about it. I've written two books about Amazon and Jeff Bezos, so I certainly know about the intrigue of covering a powerful and potentially vengeful technology executive. Similarly, understanding Peter Thiel, particularly his association with the Trump administration, is critical to understanding Silicon Valley, where it's been over the past decade, and where it's going now. An important housekeeping tip before we get started: if you have a question for Max, please place it in the YouTube chat box, and questions will be forwarded to me throughout the program. So with no further delay, Max, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Brad. Thank you for doing this, and thank you to everybody for watching. I'm really excited to be doing this conversation. I wish we could be in person, at the Commonwealth Club, but
at those
Zoom.
swank new offices on the Embarcadero, indeed. Well, Max, I want to start with a number that I'm sure you're familiar with: 140 million. That, of course, was the judgment that the wrestler known as Hulk Hogan was awarded against Gawker Media, and as we all know, Peter Thiel, the famous investor, bankrolled that lawsuit. So I want to start off by asking, probably the most sensitive question of all, which is, why write a book about someone who we know is so hypersensitive to the way he is portrayed in the popular media?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I have thought a lot about, and there are probably a bunch of different ways to answer that. And I mean, the first, I want to give you a kind of quick kind of why Peter Thiel, and then I'll talk about Gawker, and I'm sure we can expand on the kind of
yes, and I'd like to go back to Gawker, but
yeah. But yeah, I mean, the reason why Peter Thiel is just because I think he is, if not the one of a very small handful of the most significant kind of players in Silicon Valley over the last couple of decades, really of his generation. There are a handful of other people, Jeff Bezos, as you know, Elon Musk is probably another one, but I think Thiel's influence has been really interesting and singular, both in terms of kind of the companies he's been involved in and also kind of this ideological influence. And on top of that, of course, Thiel has this really interesting, kind of political story and a story about power. And of course, the Gawker case, is part of that. And it was part of, I think, the appeal of Peter Thiel to people in the Trump circle. He was the one who went after this liberal media outlet. And of course, it hangs over this conversation, and pretty much any time any journalist does a story about Peter Thiel, this is in the back of the journalist's mind. It's in the back of the editor's mind. It's in the back of maybe the reader's minds. And I think that makes it, tough to do journalism and to do good journalism. But it also, of course, creates an opportunity because, I don't think people had really dug into Thiel in this kind of in such a comprehensive way. I thought, when I was starting out, it's kind of like, why hasn't anyone done this book? Well, one reason, of course, is because Peter Thiel, put down a marker to intimidate people, or not just to intimidate people, but I would argue that was one of the reasons. There are other reasons, and again, we can get into those. People keep saying, well, aren't you afraid that Peter Thiel is going to go after you? This book, it's the book is balanced, and I think there's stuff in here for people who really admire him. I think there are things about Peter Thiel that are absolutely worthy of admiration, but it also has critical stuff in it. And so people say, aren't you afraid or something? And my response has been, yeah, of course. But again, I don't know there's any reason why another billionaire couldn't take Peter Thiel's playbook and just put it to work. And that's kind of what's so interesting about this Gawker case. It's not just a marker for Peter Thiel, but I would argue that any tech billionaire could follow this playbook. Peter Thiel is very conveniently, I guess, created a playbook and also kind of a permission structure that perhaps makes having a conversation like this a little bit harder, but also maybe more rewarding.
Right. So I like how in the book, some of his colleagues, current and former, who you spoke with, actually posed that question to you. Aren't you afraid that he'll come after you?
Yeah, and of course it hangs over meetings with potential sources, and I think it gets it gets at both how Peter Thiel is related to the media, but also how people in this world relate to one another. I mean, one thing about this kind of Thiel world, the Thiel verse, I call it in the book, and that, you know, is a term you hear thrown around, is that, you know, loyalty is very important. And disloyalty, in other words, talking to a journalist or making a public statement or whatever is not rewarded. And so of course there are people who you know, that I'm speaking to who are thinking about the Gawker lawsuit and the potential for litigation. But I think the more immediate fear, of course, is just being frozen out of this incredibly you know, rich and varied influence network. You know, Thiel has, you know, an enormous amount of money willing to put at his disposal, but then there are, you know, dozens and dozens of other investors who, because of personal relationships or because they have, you know, some of Peter Thiel's money as an LP in their firm, you know, who are also kind of part of this network. And it definitely creates, you know, some ideological and I guess kind of, you know, conformity, which is an odd thing to say about somebody who is a contrarian, but it is kind of how it works.
We should probably describe to some of the folks who are listening today and in the future who Peter Thiel is, right? I mean, they might be familiar with him because of his affiliation with the Trump administration. He's on the Facebook board, but they might not have a real understanding of how important and how influential he's been in the last 20 years of Silicon Valley history. So give us a thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, it's really funny because if you had asked somebody in, say, 1998 who is Peter Thiel, or in 2008 who is Peter Thiel, or in 2018, you'd get different answers. And so the answer in 1998 would be he is a promising conservative activist, kind of the next Dinesh D'Souza or something like that. It's crazy that sounds. Peter Thiel, before getting involved in tech, was best known as this guy who had started a kind of very conservative, kind of bomb-throwing newspaper at Stanford called the Stanford Review. He then went on to write a book called The Diversity Myth, which was kind of this, young conservative, taking the piss out of the liberal elites, and that was kind of who he was. And then he starts PayPal, and PayPal was, both very successful and also just because both, I think, because of the force of Thiel's personality and because of some of the personalities from the other folks, these big personalities, Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, Keith Rabois, there's a long list of people who are really, very in their own way, I guess, charismatic. It had a huge influence. Thiel then starts Palantir shortly after PayPal goes public and is sold to eBay. Palantir is basically a data mining company. Its main client was and is the US government, but of course there are lots of other corporate clients. And then Thiel becomes this kind of wildly successful hedge fund manager, which is another kind of weird act that happened next, where all of a sudden, if you ask somebody in 2008, who's Peter Thiel, they would have said, well, he's one of the world's most successful hedge fund managers. And so while that's going on, he's continuing to invest. And of course, the final act, I would say, is Thiel as this political actor, as somebody who had this enormous amount of success in the technological world, kind of could be credited with, as I said, creating Silicon Valley. He's the leader, the Don of what's known as the PayPal Mafia, which is this network of early PayPal folks. And then he sees another opportunity in the candidacy of Donald Trump and manages kind of in a very short amount of time to raise his profile from being somebody who's, was well known in the tech world. And I'm sure most of the people, here kind of knew who he was, but he's suddenly operating on a new and I would argue maybe more interesting level. And that's kind of where, from my point of view, when it really got interesting to think about a book, because Thiel had, of course, a huge influence on Silicon Valley, but then the idea that this tech guy, this venture capitalist, this futurist who happens to be an immigrant, who happens to be gay, would support, Donald Trump, who is running on a kind of reactionary platform. Trump is almost proud he doesn't, use email, let alone, do the kinds of things that Peter Thiel wants. He's, super anti-immigrant, hardline anti-immigrant. He's part of a political party that is in generally hostile to the interests of gays and lesbians. And so for all these reasons, it just seems like a weird contrast. And I think that is what both drew me to the story and also, kind of kept me in it, over the last few years as I was writing.
Well, I hope we have time to pick apart all these interesting and contradictory chapters of his life and career. Of course, when you start these kinds of unauthorized biographies, there's always an awkward dance with the subject. And so I'm curious for you what it was like, whether Peter was amenable. I mean, he's written a little bit about his own life, and maybe some of his own kind of acolytes have written about him. Was he interested at all in a neutral third party writing a book about him?
Yeah, I mean, so I approached this, and I was pretty cognizant of the fact that, obviously Teal has a contentious relationship with the media. One of the things in my experience, having been a journalist and been doing kind of magazine writing for a long time, the thing that kind of gets you in fights with your subjects is when kind of the proposal changes, right? Where you propose one thing and then eventually it turns into something else, which is kind of an inevitable part of journalism, but of course it leads to conflict. I tried really hard to describe the book the way I'm about to describe it to you, to Peter Thiel and to everybody else. And that was, he's this person who there are all these myths about him, right? There's the kind of sort of lefty myth about Peter Thiel, where he's this kind of evil, vampiric data monger who's just like, siphoning Facebook data, and doing God knows what with it, and secretly, supporting Donald Trump. Again, this is just the myth. I'm not endorsing this. And then there is the myth of Peter Thiel as this superhero, as this Ayn Randian builder, as an intellectual, kind of not only just one of the great minds of his generation, but also one of the great doers of his generation. And that's something that a lot of folks, kind of in the tech world, are really buy into and are really excited about. And my proposal was basically to treat Peter Thiel as a human and to try to cut through both those myths, because obviously there's truth to both of those things. And we can untangle that. But I wanted to just write a neutral, as you said, a fair book. And that's what I proposed to Thiel, and also to the sources I talked to. These are friends, colleagues, former classmates, really anyone who was involved in his companies or had known him, in his personal life. And Thiel was, I would say, not enthusiastic about this. I approached his publicist, his PR person, and had a series of conversations that led to a meeting, an off the record meeting with Peter Thiel in LA. There was then a fact checking process at the end. He was not enthusiastic, bordering on cold to the idea, but also didn't go out of his way to stop me. I didn't feel any. I think people in his network were discouraged from speaking to me, but I did not get any. But there's a big difference between that, discouraging people to talk to the journalist, and intimidation. And I never was threatened, or even there were no veiled threats. There was nothing like that from Thiel or anyone who was, I think, speaking for him. And I think that is, to my mind as a journalist, that's to his credit. I mean, he didn't, I really do think it would be great if Peter Thiel were able to, or willing to be more transparent and to talk to journalists more. I think the work that we do is really important, but I also think it's great. I was able to do my job, and for somebody who has, destroyed a media outlet, that's not saying much. I mean, that's saying something.
Right. Well, one of the things that I loved about the book, Max, was how you shed light on the history and the kind of political posture of Silicon Valley. I think there's a public impression that this is a liberal democratic stronghold, allied with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and now Joe Biden. There's this idea that it's sprung out of the counterculture. You actually write, Silicon Valley in its purest form is the military industrial complex. Its founders weren't dropping LSD. They were proud squares with politics that were close to those of David Starr Jordan, the first Stanford president, then to the radicals of Stewart Brand's imagination. So what did you learn about the Valley's political leanings that maybe doesn't jibe exactly with the popular understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not to sort of take away from, there's been a ton of amazing journalism and writing, including the Stewart Brand essay that you're referencing about the Valley and about the countercultural roots of the Valley. I think that's all true. And of course, there are kind of two threads to Silicon Valley. One is this countercultural thread, which I would argue has gotten more weight probably than the other thread, which is equally, if not more important. But I think we all, and me and many other journalists and others who have just been around this world, we sort of, because of Steve Jobs and because of the success of Apple in particular, but also Google and some of these other companies, you know, it's kind of easy to draw a line to again to the counterculture straight to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, of course, a hippie who dropped acid and who was a fruitarian. And you start to think, oh, okay, so like that's what Silicon Valley is. It's just kind of the culmination of that. But of course, there's a second thread, which is you said it, the military industrial complex, and not just that, but this kind of really like libertarianism on steroids, where it's not just, you know, the government should be out of our lives, but it would be better if we kind of got rid of the government as a whole. And you can kind of see like that thread is related to the countercultural thread. It's not totally distinct, and I think it's, you know, it's fair to ask if, you know, maybe they're all one and the same or something. But I do think that Thiel was tapping into something and has tapped into something really successfully, which is both the kind of conservative, ultra libertarian roots of Silicon Valley, and also Silicon Valley as this hotbed of military technology. And of course, Peter Thiel, most of his net worth is coming right now anyway. I mean, of course, this can change, and you know, Stripe is probably going to continue to grow, and who knows. But right now, you know, most of his net worth is coming from Palantir, and Palantir is, you know, a lot like the old school Silicon Valley companies. In fact, and Palantir has kind of embraced that identity, even as they've left Silicon Valley. They're technically, you know, based in Denver now.
Okay, well, I'd like to dive into the book now, but I want to invite viewers and listeners to ask Max questions in the YouTube comments, and we'll pose them later in the conversation. Max, I want to talk about young Peter. You talked to a former classmate, calling him a strange boy. And certainly there's a sense in your biography of Peter Thiel's early years that he had the sense that the world was against him. You know, what happened early in Peter's life that maybe, you know, gave him that sense?
Yeah. So, you know, Thiel was, and I guess to some extent still is, even though he's a billionaire, kind of an outsider. His, you know, child of immigrants, his parents are you know, German born. He's born in Germany, evangelical Christians. Family moved around a whole lot. I mean, they bounced from Cleveland, where his dad was enrolled at Case Western University, to apartheid South Africa, where his dad worked, you know, kind of in mining, back to California. And I think a couple of things. I mean, one is the family was conservative. Thiel is conservative. You know, the California that Peter Thiel inhabited in the, you know, 70s and 80s, not as left as today's California. But I do think that there may have been, you know, culture shock, right? A sense that, like, you know, especially when he gets to Stanford, and had spent some of his childhood in apartheid South Africa, you know, you know, his father's working in uranium mining, which is definitely a field that was pretty tied in closely with the, you know, apartheid regime. That, you know, it's kind of hitting you in the face, this sudden feeling that you are on the outside looking in. I also think, you know, background aside, Thiel is incredibly smart, brilliant. He is introverted, and, you know, kind of reserved. And I think like that those qualities, of course, tend to make for difficult childhoods, you know, but it's, you become a target for bullies, and Thiel, of course, was bullied.
And
you
quote one of his classmates saying that what we were doing was probably bullying. Why was he targeted?
I mean, I think he was targeted for the usual reason that nerds are targeted. I mean, but I do think he, even then, right, was clearly had this chip on his shoulder. This, you know, I mean, I think one of the reasons that people sort of went after him is they could see it was working, right? He was getting mad, and when you're getting mad, it, you know, it feeds onto itself. But yeah, that classmate, you know, who had been one of his tormentors, you know, I genuinely felt bad about it, and you know, and talked about that. I think the other thing about him, you know, he was just exceedingly ambitious. Somebody who really saw himself as, you know, correctly destined for greatness. he's very good at chess. He was, sort of nationally ranked chess player. He had this sense of himself, this incredible, talking to people in college, this incredible self-possession, which is kind of an interesting thing for somebody who was bullied and, who didn't have a lot of really close friends. And, that combination of ambition and self-possession and a chip on your shoulder, I mean, that can obviously be really powerful. And I think it's not that, given all that, when you see him sort of become this world beater first, in college, when he starts this newspaper that not only makes waves in Stanford and causes lots of trouble in Palo Alto, but also gets the attention of Bill Bennett, the Secretary of Education. I mean, Peter Thiel is like being quoted in media as an undergraduate. Bill Bennett is talking about this event that Peter Thiel organized, in 1987 on like the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. It's like he really just managed to kind of vault himself into this higher echelon immediately in this weird, political venue. And so I think that, in some ways, like all of that difficulty in childhood probably set him up for the success that followed.
Right. No, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the Stanford years and his conversion into really a right-wing provocateur. Right. That is where it starts, where he and his colleagues at the Stanford conservative newspaper are really just throwing bombs. They're looking to incite the student body.
Yeah, and you go back and read this stuff, and it's very far out there, and there are a bunch of examples in the book, and in general, just to summarize, the general vector of it is sort of like these liberals and their mores are ruining Stanford as it used to be, and they're too nice to the concerns of Black people. They're too accommodating of the concerns of women. They're too accommodating of the concerns of gays. And those things, that line of questioning, right? It's like one half step away from saying something racist, sexist, or homophobic. And at times, the Stanford Review would go there, and it would create these huge controversies. And then you get the controversy on top of the controversy, right? Where the Stanford Review gets to say, oh, look, we're getting persecuted, and I think anyone who has paid attention to kind of politics today, and particularly like right-wing politics, the alt-right, will recognize some of this stuff. I mean, this is kind of the prototype of what we think of as trolling, of the kind of behavior that we saw on the web, and elsewhere that actually created a lot of energy for Donald Trump, and of course Peter Thiel knows a lot of those people and was at least talking to them and somewhat supportive. The other thing it's probably worth saying is, back in the 80s, there was this, Thiel was not in a vacuum, right? There were on other college campuses at there's a Dartmouth Review, which is Dinesh D'Souza's paper. There was a Cornell Review, which was Ann Coulter's paper. This was like a tried and true path to, quickly getting credibility, on the right. And Thiel just very beautifully saw the opportunity and latched onto it. And then that network that he created at Stanford, the Stanford Review, really is the beginning, is the seed of the PayPal network. And that's something that's underappreciated, but I think it actually gave PayPal a lot of its sort of cohesiveness and maybe its power once it got going.
Well, that's a great segue, because I do want to fast forward through Peter's career and get to the PayPal years. I mean, there's really so much to cover that we kind of do need to hit fast forward. So, Peter has a sort of short-lived legal career, moves to Silicon Valley, founds PayPal. But the story, Max, I want you to tell is his conflict with Elon Musk, because what always fascinated me is that Peter is like the one guy to stab Elon in the back and survive. And today, the Founders Fund, Peter's firm, has invested in SpaceX. They seem to continue to have a relationship. But tell the story of Thiel, of a young Peter Thiel, really outmaneuvering Elon Musk at PayPal.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that your take on that, it really speaks both to, Thiel's power, because as we know, and persuasiveness and gamesmanship, because as we know, Elon Musk is not somebody who suffers fools lightly. And normally when you screw him, there's hell to pay. So it's easy to forget, in retrospect, we remember PayPal, but we sort of forget that there were all these other payments companies, right? This wasn't the idea of starting a payments company wasn't like some brilliant idea. There were like a dozen of these, and they all had funny names. And of course there were so many, in fact, that, there were two payments companies in the same building. Elon Musk's Peter Thiel's PayPal and Elon Musk's X.com actually shared an office for a short period of time. The two companies merged, and it was a merger of equals, but Elon being both more experienced, better funded, more famous, and also a sole founder, was able to basically get control of the venture. He became CEO. Peter is marginalized, kind of more or less forced out. He quits. But crucially, this kind of network of Peter Thiel friends, these ex-Stanford Review guys, plus Max Levchin, this brilliant coder who is actually the guy who kind of did the actual engineering behind the original PayPal, and some of Max's friends, they were still loyal to Peter. And there is this coup where they show up at the office of Mike Moritz and present an ultimatum. And the ultimatum is, either you fire Elon or we're all walking out. And which is another way of saying either you fire Elon or the company's going to go under. Because remember, this is like the dot-com bubble is crashing around them. Things are very hectic. And crucially, probably the only reason this was able to happen is because Elon Musk was not in the country. I mean, they waited for Elon to be, overseas. He was in Australia, I think, kind of on a combination business trip, honeymoon. He was going to try to raise some money and then, take in the Summer Olympics. Comes back, of course, and he's been done in by his co-founder. And the amazing thing is, so Elon Musk, predictably, if you know him, he raged, and but then he relented, and he relented because he saw the same thing that Mike Moritz saw, which was there's one way forward, and this is the way. And I think, the fact that he and Peter found a way to kind of work together is both a testament to, I suppose, the power of forgiveness and things like that. But it's also a testament to the extent to which Elon, I think, saw and saw correctly that Peter was a force to be reckoned with, and he's better off having Peter as a friend than as an enemy. And I think it kind of worked the same way with both of them. They have this kind of uneasy alliance, and then it pays off in 2008 when SpaceX is really desperate for funding, and there's Founders Fund, Peter Thiel's firm, ready to make an investment that effectively saved SpaceX and maybe saved Elon Musk's solvency. Because if SpaceX fails there, I don't know. I mean, the whole Musk kind of world at that point was very, very tenuous. I'm sure the companies would have turned into something, but it's hard to imagine Tesla would be what it is today, and certainly not SpaceX had that deal not been done.
You have an amazing and combustible quote in the book that I just have to read. Thiel thinks that Elon Musk is a poser and a fraud, while Musk considers Thiel a sociopath. I mean, that's just amazing. And yet it does seem like they have, and I guess that's a third party quote, right? From someone who knows them both. That's not Max talking, but it's amazing that they've had a productive relationship if that's their posture towards each other.
They are just very different people. I mean, and anyone who's talked to them knows this. I mean, they are, Musk is this kind of effusive, he's funny, he wears his heart on his sleeve, and he also has this tendency to just sort of double, triple, quadruple, just keep betting on the same thing. Thiel, of course, is cerebral, he's reserved, and I think funny, but funny in a different way, and of course is all about hedging his bets and finding angles and kind of gamesmanship, and Musk is just more like in your face. So it's like two different styles, but of course they found a way to work together, and they've had over 20 years this kind of awkward but mutually beneficial relationship.
So PayPal, of course, is sold to eBay. Peter starts a hedge fund called Clarium Capital, and we're going to fast forward in another few years, and Clarium really hits a pothole during the Great Recession. And that is what fuels his lawsuit against Gawker. I had never made that connection until I read your book. So where did he go wrong with Clarium, and why did he take it out on this gossip site that was clearly needling him at the time for his investment record and for his lifestyle?
Well, I think it's important to say, just at a baseline, that there was this Gawker post that was kind of the inciting action. Look, let's remove all the business for a second and just talk about the fact that, in 2008, Gawker Media, which had been doing actually a lot of really important journalism, really scrutinizing the tech industry and in ways that I think were positive, was also just doing kind of the most like out there gonzo kind of tawdry stuff you can imagine, including this post in 2008 said Peter Thiel is totally gay people. At the time, Thiel was out to his friends. I mean, there are people at his at the hedge fund, where that he ran, they knew he was gay. His boyfriend came to the Christmas party. It wasn't like a big secret, but it wasn't public information. It was kind of an open secret. And I think that that was the beginning of it. And that if that doesn't happen, there's no campaign against Gawker Media. I mean, for all the other stuff Gawker did. Now, it's important to say that this, Thiel felt violated by this, and I think we can say with some reason. I mean, I think it's a clearly violated his privacy and certainly as he sought his sense of self. And it wasn't, the combination of the post and then asking questions about why exactly he hadn't, talked about. I think it was just a part of his life that he wasn't, ready to talk about.
And by the way, if you don't mind me interjecting, it was also Gawker's founder, Nick Denton, leaving a kind of incendiary comment in that original post that he took offensive.
Right. That's what I was kind of getting at. It was like sort of turning the Denton left this comment, kind of turning this post another twist of the knife or whatever, where he's saying, well, and we really got to ask why he's not doing this. Is it something, what's going on with, and it's sort of an implication that, there's some kind of an attempt to sort of psychologize or whatever. Now, okay, so that sends Peter Thiel puts him in a bad place, and all the people around him, people I talked to by his own account as well, he is off his game. And at the same time, as he said, Clarium, his hedge fund, which at the time had been just on a tear, so successful, Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Bloomberg, they're all writing about how awesome this company is, how, billions of dollars under management. Thiel calls the crash of the economy right, but trades himself into an enormous hole. And, and while this is happening, Gawker is writing this drumbeat of stories about what an idiot he is. And everyone thinks Peter Thiel's a genius. Ha ha, he's not a genius, right? And I think that journalism that they were doing was actually, that was like legitimate journalism. I mean, they were pointing out things that were there and perhaps needed to be pointed out. But that combined with this post, I think was too much. And then Gawker, on top of that, is also going after all of Peter Thiel's friends. They're writing stories about Sean Parker. They're, so I think it's like a combination of real scrutiny, but then also this violation of his privacy. And Thiel tried, as I talk about in the book, there were all sorts of things that happened in the years before the Hogan lawsuit. Thiel, wanted to get Gawker, or wanted to do something to make this better, and tried all sorts of things, from sort of sweet talking, attempting to kind of, maybe court Gawker, to hiring private eyes. There was a whole series of things. And then he finally lands on this kind of both devious and brilliant strategy, which is there's this litigation going on. Hulk Hogan, professional wrestler, was wronged by Gawker in a much clearer way than Peter Thiel was wronged by Gawker, right? Hulk Hogan, there was a sex tape, and it was a private tape. It hadn't been recorded with his consent. It's basically revenge porn. And Gawker posted it. And this winds its way, thanks to Peter Thiel in part, winds its way to a jury trial, and this enormous verdict, this verdict of more than $100 million that sends Gawker to bankruptcy, puts a bunch of journalists out of work, and it sends Nick Denton, the founder of Gawker, into personal bankruptcy.
Amazing. Well, we're getting some good questions in, which we'll get to, about Thiel's support for Donald Trump and his administration. But first, I think we should talk about one of the most important relationships in the book, and that's between Mark Zuckerberg and Peter Thiel. And his investment in Facebook is really foundational to Facebook's founding, the way it's operated now. And I want to unpack one of my favorite lines in the book. Max, you write, "The Facebook founder, like almost every successful techie of his generation, isn't a liberal or a conservative. He's a Thielist. The rules do not apply." So first, let me ask you, what is a Thielist? What is Thielism?
So I'll tell you what I think it is. I mean, it's kind of made up, but I do think it's probably a helpful framework to understand both the influence of Peter Thiel, and maybe it says something about kind of some of the ideologies that are animating some of the largest companies. So Thiel obviously has all these ideological points of views. Hopefully we can talk about them. We can talk about the conservatism. We can talk about Donald Trump. But I think probably a more important part of Thiel's worldview is just this idea that technology and technology companies in particular are of paramount importance. We need to make the future happen. We need to make it faster, and we need to make it better a lot faster. And the way to do that is through these technology companies. And he has very specific ideas about how these companies should be run, most of which are laid out in 0 to 1. I think it's really worth anybody who's, you should read my book, and I think it has interesting stuff. I think if you're really interested in digging into this topic, Thiel's book is also worth reading because he lays a lot of this out. The basic thing that 0 to 1 argues is that tech companies should try to achieve monopoly profits. They should get really big, so big that they dominate markets. And you see this idea in a lot of the things that PayPal did in its early years. PayPal did kind of very aggressive growth, spent huge amounts of money, was very pushy. And then the second part of this is sort of how you get there, and you get there by essentially breaking the rules, by disrupting the status quo. And times that's going to mean potentially running afoul of regulators. That's kind of okay in this worldview, and it's more than okay, actually. It's almost encouraged, because the view is that the existing rules are bad and we need to fix them. We need to make new rules, and the way to do that is through this kind of hyper growth, where these founders, people like Mark Zuckerberg, are a privileged class, and they are able to and expected, in fact, to kind of do what they want to do so they can make the world a better place. And that is, I think, number one, I can see why that's a very helpful business philosophy, right? Especially when you're talking about an industry, the industry as it existed in, say, 2004 or 2005, when Thiel is getting involved with Facebook as the first outside investor, as the longest serving board member to Zuckerberg, as a longtime kind of mentor. Facebook was this kind of piddling company run by a, Harvard tech bro who really had no business being there, no business running a giant company by any kind of normal standard. He was basically a troublemaker who had run afoul of Larry Summers. I mean, we've all seen The Social Network, and he didn't have a lot going for him. But of course, Peter Thiel saw that Zuckerberg was something special, and not just that, but that Facebook was something special, and he helped set this young man up so that he would not only, be able to raise capital from investors and grow the company in the way that he did, but also giving Zuckerberg this kind of absolute power, where Zuckerberg, even to this day, is basically Facebook's dictator. And again, that's a way of that's a kind of an expression of Thiel's ideology, but I think it also kind of led to Facebook's success. And as I said, I think it was helpful, especially in the early years. Although now I think once you get to a couple $1 trillion in market cap, several billion users, you have to start asking yourself whether the rules, the willingness to kind of ignore the rules and kind of stick it in the eye of institutions or whatever, has gone too far.
I did keep wondering, reading the book, and of course reading current headlines, why Peter Thiel is still on the Facebook board of directors. He does seem to bring so much trouble. He invested in Clearview AI, the startup that has basically scraped photos off of Facebook. He purportedly leaked some emails from another board member. And then you have this remarkable account of this 2019 meeting with Peter and Mark Zuckerberg and Jared Kushner and Donald Trump, which I like one publication said you provided behind the spray tan details. And at the dinner, Zuckerberg and Facebook reportedly agree to take a hands-off approach to news from conservative media sites. Now, Zuck and Facebook have denied that. So tell us a little bit of what's going on there, and to belabor the question, how much water Peter Thiel still carries at Facebook.
All right, yeah, so much to unpack there. So, during the Trump administration, Thiel played this really important role, right? Where Facebook was, I'd say unfairly to some extent, under attack from conservatives for, quote unquote, discriminating against conservative views. Now, I'm just going to summarize the view. I'm not endorsing it, but the idea was basically this is a left-wing California company, and they, even though they were taking a relatively hands-off approach, they were discriminating against conservative voices. And that meme, while I think didn't have a lot of basis in fact, I mean, there was Facebook attempted to promote legitimate media outlets for a couple of months in 2016, and in doing so, was promoting the New York Times, which I guess if you squint is is promoting liberals or something. But I mean, again, not a lot of basis of fact, but this really took off, and it took off not just among the right, but in particular at the White House, where Donald Trump sort of figured out that making fun of Facebook is kind of good for business, and so he's just hammering this company nonstop. And Thiel ends up playing this kind of mediator role. On one hand, he's there to kind of help Mark Zuckerberg absorb the flack. So Mark Zuckerberg can say, listen, President Trump, I have this board member, Peter Thiel. He's not just he's not a rhino. He's a Republican, but he's a real Republican. He's a Donald Trump Republican. He's so crazy. Steve Bannon thinks he's crazy. Thiel was like a dyed-in-the-wool Trumpist, and is. And that really, I think, helped Zuckerberg, on a sort of PR level with conservatives. And then the other thing Thiel was able to do is sort of push Zuckerberg a little bit towards Donald Trump. And that's kind of what we see in this meeting in 2019 and in the events around that meeting. So, ahead of that meeting, Zuckerberg had been taking a lot of flack from prominent liberals, from Elizabeth Warren in particular, over these campaign ads that Trump and Trump's allies had been running, where they were like sort of making up stuff about Hunter Biden, or really, really torturing the truth about Hunter Biden, distributing videos of Nancy Pelosi where she, whatever, where they're manipulating them to make it look like she had some kind of neurological condition. And so Warren and others are out there saying, we got to stop this. Facebook is bad. And Zuckerberg gives this speech where he defends the company's point of view. And the speech says, basically, Facebook is about free expression. We need to allow everything. This is, very much the Peter Thiel sort of view of the company. And frankly, the Peter Thiel view to some extent of speech on the internet. And then they have this meeting that is secret, that we don't know anything about really, except that Donald Trump and Melania are there, Jared Kushner and Ivanka are there, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife are there, and Peter Thiel and his husband are there. And after that meeting, Thiel says to a friend, which is what I report in the book, that there was some kind of understanding reached. And what was the nature of that understanding? Well, we don't know for sure, and Facebook, of course, has denied it. But what we do know is, in the immediate aftermath of that meeting, Facebook creates this list of kind of media outlets that it says are respected or whatever, are going to be part of its initiative to promote kind of real news. On that list is Breitbart. Daily Caller shows up on its list of fact-checking partners, and of course there's a ton of reporting from Bloomberg, some of my colleagues at Bloomberg, and also BuzzFeed, that suggests that over the next few months, Facebook made a real effort to give leeway to some of these conservative groups, in particular, Ben Shapiro. And also we know that Facebook was a little bit slower to kind of respond to some of Trump's more incendiary posts. So when Trump says the looters get shot thing, which is a callback to George Wallace, Twitter is much quicker to act than Facebook. Facebook, of course, eventually, kind of comes around and bans Trump and kind of after the January 6th insurrection. But I think it's clear that Facebook, kind of was both worried about this conservative backlash and was doing whatever it could to cater to a sitting U.S. president, which is not. I don't think that's hugely surprising, especially given who Donald Trump is. But it does tell you something. Now, why is Thiel on the board? That is like a real question. That's a question that I have spent some time
and as you point out, he sold his stake after the IPO, so he's no longer a large shareholder.
He has done so many things over the years to send Mark Zuckerberg through the roof. And as I tell a story in the book that was related to me, from somebody who set this up, but Thiel gave a speech at Facebook after the IPO. The company is really struggling. It's like, they're getting hammered in the press. Employees are seeing the stock go down. Everyone's like really, just super depressed. So they bring in Peter Thiel, the great man, the great investor himself, the longest serving, independent director. He's a published famous author, or not yet, but he's teaching the Stanford class. He's a big deal, and he's going to go in and pump everybody up. And instead of pumping everybody up, he gives a speech where he says, we were promised flying cars, and instead we got Facebook, which is a kind of a twist on his usual talk, which is we're promised, flying cars to say we got 140 characters. That one normally makes fun of Twitter. That probably would have been just fine with Mark Zuckerberg, but instead he kind of just has a dig for Facebook. And then over the years, there are lots of these other stories where Thiel is, very supportive of Zuckerberg in certain ways, but in other ways, he seems to be kind of needling him, both encouraging kind of conservative opposition, maybe even fanning the flames a little bit of that opposition. James O'Keefe, the kind of right-wing provocateur, has been putting out these videos about all the terrible things that Facebook does, and was personally insulting Mark Zuckerberg at every turn. He is another guy who's gotten money from Peter Thiel, and there's a long list of this kind of thing. Now, I've heard two explanations for why why Zuckerberg continues to have Thiel on the board, and I think they both make sense and are both probably contain a good bit of truth. So one is that Zuckerberg respects Thiel because he tells it like it is, right? Peter Thiel is the only person who has the guts to come in and say, "Hey, Facebook, you kind of suck right now." That's something that Zuckerberg, as somebody who has kind of absolute power at this company, who's surrounded, of course, by a lot. When you have that kind of power, there's a tendency for everyone to kind of try to flatter you, and I think he respects Thiel for that. I think he respects Thiel because of Thiel's, ideological stance. He respects that Thiel kind of says what he believes. And then there's a second thing, which is that I think strategically, it would be very hard for Mark Zuckerberg to fire Peter Thiel. And maybe it's a little easier now that Joe Biden is president and the Democrats control both houses of Congress. But remember, there is Facebook, if it loses Thiel, is going to get hit all over again by the same conservatives who have been complaining about, free speech. Tucker Carlson is gonna be all over this. If Peter Thiel gets canceled, that will be an enormous news story. And I think Zuckerberg has realized, probably has realized correctly, that to push Thiel out would be, just create probably more problems than it solves. And right now, Thiel, yes, he's a critic, but maybe he can. Zuckerberg, of course, is very wealthy, and Facebook is dominant, and so Zuckerberg can afford that. And I think he probably can afford it more than he can afford, picking a fight with the entire, conservative media apparatus, which is what would happen if Peter Thiel got fired.
Interesting. Well, the subtitle of the book talks about Silicon Valley's pursuit of power, and certainly one thread of the book is Thiel's courtship of Donald Trump. He remarkably bets right on this contrarian bet on Donald Trump in 2016, and he gets a seat at the table. And what was so interesting is how he then seemingly squandered it, right? You talk about Thiel as part of the transition in 2016 and spent all his political capital nominating people who were just kind of comically unpalatable, right? And he really doesn't place anyone. So he seemingly doesn't have a lot of success placing people in his orbit into government positions, but he still capitalizes on that political power. So how were the Trump years good for Peter Thiel?
So, I think it's really tempting to look at, Thiel's kind of, as you said, political stumbles, and there is almost a comic quality to them, where like, as I report in the book, and this was in the Bloomberg excerpt, Steve Bannon, who's like, pretty out there as far as conservatives, is saying, you wouldn't believe the crazy stuff that Peter Thiel is trying, and it's like when Steve Bannon is calling you too out there, like, that is a problem, probably. That said, I don't think I would say that Thiel failed in any way. And in fact, I think in some ways he sort of played this brilliantly. So, first of all, he did get a few people into positions of power, right? It's about a dozen people, including, the head of the US CTO, who then took a pretty high-powered Defense Department research and development position. He had a very close confidant on the National Security Council, and he had, a bunch of sort of lower to mid-level figures who had worked at Palantir, worked around Palantir, who are in government. And okay, so that's not great when you were trying to go for an FDA commissioner or something like that. But I do think that it sort of all worked out because, the thing that Thiel got, besides getting these people, into the White House, the handful of people, was he got access, and he got access for himself and for many of the people who are in his inner circle. So early on, December 2016, people probably remember the pictures where Peter Thiel and Donald Trump are there, and it's like a who's who of Silicon Valley. You got Tim Cook, you've got Larry Page, you've got Jeff Bezos, you've got Microsoft CEO, you got everybody basically there. Mark Zuckerberg's not there, but Cheryl's there. And also there is Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir. Now, Palantir at the time was a really small company compared to those giants. Those are some of the biggest companies in the entire world. Palantir at the time is a private company with a market capitalization of maybe $20 billion. There are much, much larger defense contractors. If you wanted to bring in the defense heavyweights, right, that wasn't them. But this company, of course, does have very close ties to Thiel. Thiel owned 20% of the company at the time, and is that what helped propel Palantir to the amazing run of government contracts that it saw in the years that followed? I don't know. And Palantir will say that it had, this access had nothing to do with their success. Their success was totally about the software, not about the politics. But of course, I mean, when you're talking about these, defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, politics is always going to come into play. And I just can't imagine that that those relationships didn't hurt. And the upshot is that Thiel, at the end of the Trump presidency, Palantir has grown in size enormously. It's gone from being really this kind of sideshow thing to being a major player.
So it's about a $50 billion market cap at the end of the Trump administration. So 20 billion private valuation of 50 billion public company market cap.
Yeah, and just tons of momentum too. Not just the market cap. There's a reason investors are valuing it that way, because it's just been on fire. I mean, they have an $800 million Army contract, a $400 million Defense Department contract. All these during COVID, there are all these HHS contracts that they were able to get. And so that has increased Thiel's net worth dramatically. As I said, he is the biggest shareholder in the company. Before the IPO, he owned about 20%. So that is good. It's good for his bottom line. He is definitely a lot richer than he was, going into the Trump presidency. Now, what about the influence? Because you would expect, okay, maybe he mortgaged all his influence for business success, but I don't think that's true at all. And I think actually, maybe it was just an accident that Thiel kind of struck out during the Trump transition, or maybe it was strategic. But either way, he leaves he ends these 4 years without being tied that closely to Donald Trump. And that in the end is actually pretty valuable, because he comes off, number one, as a tried and true ideologue. He is a believer. If you want to find a rich guy who really believes in the principles of Trumpism, look no further than Peter Thiel. Some of these other donors, the Kochs, they backed away from Trump, not Thiel. He stays true, but because he was kind of cast out early, he doesn't take any of the blame. And now we're seeing him emerge as this really important kind of patron to this Trump movement. And now the Trump movement, or whatever you want to call it, sometimes people call it the Patriot Party or something. It's this kind of rump of the Republican Party that's embracing, this hard right populist nationalism. It is not a big part of the electorate, and I think it's pretty unlikely that a Trump style candidate is going to win the presidency, but it may be enough to win some Republican primaries, and it may even be enough to win some Senate races. And Thiel is playing big this cycle in the Senate, which I think is telling. He's already on the hook for more than $20 million between 2 Senate races and a handful of other things, and that's way more than he's ever spent. So I think he's not acting like somebody who's seen his influence diminish. Nobody in the Republican Party is treating him that way. And I think you have to look at it like, he played the Trump administration well. Love him or hate him, the guy is an amazing chess player.
And by the way, Max, we had a good audience question. It seems Trump became even too much for Peter Thiel by the end of his presidency. Do you think Thiel would support Trump again in 2024, or is he done?
I think so. So Thiel never embraced Trump during the 2020 election. And as you said, there was a sense that maybe Trump had done something to get under his skin. I think too much is not quite the way I would put it. I think it has more to do with perceived competence. Trump was kind of floundering. I think if Thiel had any problem with Trump, it wasn't that Trump was too out there. It was that Trump was not disciplined and was ineffective. Thiel has made some comments. They haven't really been noticed, and I think he's been pretty strategic about it. But he gave an interview with this Swiss media outlet in 2020, kind of just before the election, where he not only said he still supported Trump, he said he agreed with Trump on COVID. He basically proclaimed himself still a Trumpist. And when you look at what his kind of senior staff, the people who kind of have worked with him for a number of years, and also these kind of candidates who are taking his money, they're all signaling that, they would be open to a Trump candidacy in 2024. Although I think that Thiel and many of the other folks in this movement would much prefer if it weren't Trump. But the thing is, it's like the Trump voters are the people they're catering to. So I think it's still up in the air. I think if Trump runs, yes, Peter Thiel will support him, certainly covertly and probably overtly.
Well, it's certainly looking like we will see that scenario unfold. Max, I'm going to ask you a question that I sometimes get in relation to Jeff Bezos. I always find it annoying, and yet I'm going to ask you the question, which is kind of where do you net out on what motivates Peter Thiel? Is it real ideological conviction? Is it financial return? Is it the accumulation of power? What is driving him right now?
Well, I think there's not a single answer, and I think it's a combination of financial returns. But of course, for Thiel, those financial returns are tied to technology as he sees it. So it's this kind of desire to grow these tech companies, and in doing so, to grow his net worth as quickly as possible. But of course, there's also this ideological ambition. And I think those two things are basically inseparable. Well, when I was working on this project, I read Cokeland, which is Christopher Leonard's portrait of Coke Industries. And I think there's a really good parallel between kind of the Peter Thiel world and the Cokes, because, the Cokes had this kind of business, these kind of industrial companies, and they had this political project, and the industrial companies are generating money, which is feeding the political project, which is then hopefully, from their point of view, changing the rules and making the companies do better. And it's this kind of virtuous, or, if you're a critic, a vicious cycle of money and ideology. And I think it's kind of the same thing with Peter Thiel. The difference is, instead of kind of old line industrial, natural gas and stuff, we're talking about this kind of post-industrial economy. And instead of the mainstream Republican Party, the Republican Party of Reagan and George W. Bush, we're talking about the Republican Party of Donald Trump and the kind of Trumpist movement. So I think it's both. And I think he's somebody for whom it's very, very hard to separate ideology from the kind of business, from the money that comes at the end of business.
Well, Max, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So I want to go into a lightning round here. Okay, so we need quick answers. There's no conversation about Peter Thiel that's complete without talking about some of his more unusual bets. So we're going into what I want to call a good bet or bad bet speed round here. You talk about Peter's freak flag stage, where he's investing in some really weird things. He's got some longevity startups. Does Peter Thiel want to live forever? Is that a good bet or a bad bet?
I think he is definitely interested in extending his lifespan. I don't think there's been a whole lot of progress there, but it's been kind of amazing branding for Peter Thiel.
Right. Psychedelics to treat mental illness. I don't know if you heard about this one, but a magic mushroom company that he's recently invested in. Good bet or bad bet?
I mean, I think, it seems like a good bet. I don't know. I mean, I think it totally fits in the kind of Peter Thiel, let's bend the rules. Let's find the sort of regulatory areas where regulation is wrong and try to change them. There's, of course, a lot of research. I've read some of this. I read Michael Pollan's Change Your Mind. It seems like there are definitely applications. So it seems like it makes sense. And it feels like frankly, a perfect venue for Peter Thiel. It's a perfect combination of taboo with money, and he's super into drugs and drug regulation, and the idea of kind of pushing the envelope on kind of what the FDA will allow. Maybe there's a world where we can experiment on this in a seastead, which is another one of his crazy ideas.
Right. Okay, I didn't have that on my list, but you could answer that one. But I was going to ask, good bet or bad bet, New Zealand.
I think New Zealand is a lovely country. I don't think it's really worked out for him yet. He has spent very little time there. And I think, as I argue in the book, I think the acquiring New Zealand citizenship was partly a backup plan in case the political things didn't work out for him. And of course, Donald Trump became president. He didn't have to spend any time in New Zealand. That said, I mean, I've looked at his property. It's in New Zealand. It seems like a very nice place. And I think there were just permits put forward. They're doing some renovations. So maybe I think the jury's still out on that one. It hasn't really paid off as a political bet, though.
And this is an apocalyptic, basically last resort for him?
Well, I don't think it is, because I think we just have gone through an apocalypse, and I can tell you where he was, and he wasn't in New Zealand. He was in Maui, and of course, as an apocalypse destination, Maui and New Zealand have a lot in common, but Maui's a little bit closer, and just shorter trip on the plane. You don't have to gas up, and they, it's probably a little bit easier. I think it was more of a regulatory arbitrage opportunity, but of course, when the world falls apart, it's nice to have multiple bunkers.
He's also placed a contrarian bet against San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Good bet or bad bet?
Well, I think I have to say it's a bad bet. We're talking to the Commonwealth Club here. I mean, I think that his bet there has always been somewhat overblown. And when he was, after, making this big speech about, leaving Silicon Valley, Founders Fund, which is his VC firm, they're still based in San Francisco to some extent, although there's been a little bit of movement to Miami lately. I don't think we've really seen anything that seriously threatens, the preeminence of Silicon Valley yet. Now, of course, that could change. And when you have somebody as influential and as powerful as Peter Thiel, then that's something that I think you need to take seriously. So hopefully people in San Francisco are taking seriously, but taking it seriously, although I'm not sure I would be panicking quite yet.
Well, one more in this game of Peter Thiel, good bet or bad bet. Roth IRA. This is he's funneled many of his investment winnings into this personal retirement account, but we're right at the verge perhaps of a rewriting of some of these tax laws. So good bet or bad bet?
I'm going to say so far, phenomenal bet. I mean, he's managed to squirrel away, more than $5 million in this investment account that was originally designed for, to not have, more than a couple of $1,000s per year into it. As you say, there's a backlash, and that backlash could result in tax bills for Peter Thiel. That said, two points that I think are worth considering. One is this strategy that he's adopted has become very popular. So Peter Thiel, as we've talked about, can be a vindictive billionaire who has a lot of influence at his disposal and a ton of money. He's not going to be the only opponent of this. There are going to be a lot of rich people who are really upset about this. So I think it's going to be hard to push through. And even if it is pushed through and Thiel has to pay a tax bill, in the billions of dollars, I think, it's not the worst thing that, it's as my accountant sometimes says, you've had a good year. So it's, I think he'll live.
Yeah, I think he will be okay. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today's program. I want to thank the Commonwealth Club for hosting it. Of course, I want to encourage everyone to purchase Mac's tremendous book, The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. You can buy it wherever books are sold. Max, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Brad, and thanks everybody for watching.
I'm Brad Stone of Bloomberg, and this Commonwealth Club program is now adjourned.